everybody, my name is Farrell from Transport for All. I would just like to briefly introduce and ask the candidates about access to transport. So, Transport for All is a disability rights organisation involving disabled people, and we champion access and travel in London and work obviously with local people here in Newham as well. For us, we're really passionate about the fact that transport is really the thread that connects people to all areas of their life, to work, to home, to family, friends, local high street. It's pretty scandalous that even in 2015, living in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, one of the wealthiest cities in the world, party or parties, what are you going to do about improving accessible transport? And what I'd like to say is that when I asked this question to candidates at our last Hustings event, everyone went back to talking about Transport for London controlled services. And obviously we are in London, and Transport for London and also local authorities control. But I'm going to ask you, if you were the parliamentary candidate, what you're going to do in your remit in terms of national government to look at funding and policies around accessible transport, please. And also to just put your attention to the 7 demands that we have, which are around rail station accessibility, bus accessibility, ending some discrimination on taxi and private hire vehicles, but also number 7, which is taking a trip with a disabled, an older disabled constituent to see yourself the first-hand reality of travelling, as a disabled older person. So yeah, so the question is, what would you do in Parliament if you were the local MP, elected, re-elected, around government, changing government policy? And please do don't talk about Transport for London related transport or indeed local authority, but what the government can do. Thank you very much.
Shall we go in the opposite direction for a while and start with Samir next time?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, so firstly on point 7, you speak to me straight after. I'd love to come along with you. I'm sure probably everyone else will, because as you said, unless you actually get first-hand experience, you don't realise how difficult it is. I think what we need to do, and what we need to make sure we keep doing, is sticking with the Access for All funding programme. We've committed another £100 million up until 2019 to make. What we've already done is looked at the 150 most inaccessible stations, which aren't just in London. You need to look outside of London as well, and trying to make them a lot more accessible for disabled people. In 2010, we made sure taxi vehicles and similar vehicles within London, private hire vehicles, also had to start beginning to adhere to having some accessibility for people with disabilities. But there's a long way to go yet. I mean, as I said before, we're looking at 2020 as a target, realistic target, let's say, for all rail vehicles to have an accessibility point for people with disabilities to come and do that. If we look at the buses, we look at in 2015. We made sure that many of the single buses had to now adhere to the accessibility rules for people with disabilities. And again, we've now pledged that we've got a new target for 2016, another certain number for 2018 and for 2020 to include double-decker buses as well. And you're right, a lot more needs to be done. And I think it's a shame really, because with the best will in the world, I don't think any government, and let's be honest, whether you're Labour, Tory, Green or whoever it may be, no one wants to legislate against, and no one wants the worst for those that are not as better off, in terms of physically better off in society. But I think within the last Parliament, I think the government, what they tried to do was get back on their feet and make sure there was the funding, and the economy was stable enough for us to allow funding for these various schemes. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how much further we can get if we do get back in government. We're pushing things forward, but we're already excited with 100 million that we've pledged up until 2019.
Thanks. That's a good question raised in a good way. Just to go through very quickly some of the national policies. First of all, private hire. it's our policy to make accessibility a licence condition as a national policy for private drive vehicles. Secondly, we think it's rather regrettable the High Court, the Appeal Court decision on the use of wheelchairs in buses. And I think there's been a lot of progress, more in London than the rest of the UK, so that we need to roll out the rest of the UK what's happened in London with the improved access in the vehicles and the kneeling vehicles and this sort of thing, which had been customary in lots of countries around the world long before it was in the UK. But there was a decision which was rather difficult, which is that the buses don't have an obligation to give priority to wheelchair users on buses if there's buggies and things like that. My feeling is that we need to legislate to deal with that problem. Unfortunately, we do need to legislate, I think, now. On the question of National Rail, part of the difficulty in disabled access and full access in National Rail stations is that the franchisees sort of manage the stations and collect the revenue and so on. But the stations, the physical ownership of the stations is the state company Railtrack. So in the end, what we have to do is to ensure that the franchise conditions include upgrading. At the moment, it's done in a rather cumbersome way, with the central government providing funding for individual stations. It should be increased, nevertheless, it is a rather cumbersome way of doing it. So I think it's much better to have the franchisees, whether they state or private, to have an obligation to upgrade and to include in the bids. And in some cases, you can actually revise there are conditions in all of these franchisee arrangements where you can make additions to obligations, but the government is often in a weak position to try and get good value for the money being spent. But it's a complex issue. It's not one of those things where you can just sort of make a sweeping spending commitment, although we have, but it's not enough. I've already said something about the TfL. I mean, it is rather lamentable that after the Overground was upgraded, essentially for the Olympics, only half of the stations have step-free access. I mean, it's pretty appalling if you think about the money that was spent. And I've already said something about the tube system. We'll probably come back to that in a moment. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Well, the Green Party is committed to renationalising national transport, particularly the railways. And we've already brought in a private members bill that will actually take the railway franchises back into public hands, one by one, as they become available. So we know that this is possible to do. And I would rather trust disabled access to a joined up Railtrack and which is in national hands, as Samir rightly pointed out, with publicly owned rail transport and coach franchises. So if we have that joined up thinking, we won't have any of this, we don't have to provide accessible stations because we don't own the station. We'd be able to actually talk to each other and cooperate on disabled access. And I think that's so important. When we fragment the service, disabled people suffer. So, and we've already seen how the East Coast Rail Service managed far better and delivered back £1 billion to the national coffers than the failing franchise that we took it over from. So we see how public transport, national infrastructure, is better for everybody when it's owned and run by the government. And I want to say that I spent a year in a wheelchair myself, and transport was horrendous. And I have no idea what it's like to manage day to day. I just had a year, but I really sympathise with the transport conditions that are faced by disabled people, and I love the talking buses. And I think we need to roll that out nationally so that anyone, no matter where they're travelling, is able to understand where they are and how to access what they need. So, and we have, in the manifesto, we have all the costings to do this. So I'd encourage you to read it. I don't want to bore anyone anymore with financial things, but it is in there, it is possible.
Stephen?
I think accessible to all stations point is a very, very important one. Interesting, the reason that the Jubilee line, the newer bit of the Jubilee line, is accessible is because Newham Council, when I was leader of it, had an objection into the bill in Parliament, which the council rightly absolutely refused to remove until the commitment was given to make the new Jubilee line accessible. And I think that was a service that Newham Council provided to London as a whole, a very valuable one. I think it's disappointing, the figure that somebody has given us for access funding for the next period up to 2019 is, I think, it's about a 40% reduction on the amount of money that's been provided in the current period. So I'm worried we're going backwards on that. I really think we ought to be doing more. On the disability equality training for bus drivers, I think we seem to be doing better in London on that than in other parts of the country. But the European Union has introduced a directive to make disability equality training mandatory for bus drivers. Unfortunately, the British government negotiated an opt-out from that requirement, and that was the Lib Dems Minister, Norman Becker.
If I could just add, there is also a directive that says that wheelchairs should be made a priority on buses in the same legislation.
Yeah.
But there was also opted out of
Not priority.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be really clear about that the spaces that are provided in buses are primarily for wheelchairs. That is the reason the spaces are there. Now, of course, it's nice for people with buggies, no doubt, to use them, but they're actually, the space is there for wheelchair users, and I think that's an important aspect of that equality training that bus drivers need to recognise. That's what it's there for. That is the priority, because otherwise people in wheelchairs are not able to move around at all.
No.
The High Court decision was against it. There was an appeal,
Yes.
and it was concluded that the TfL don't have the right to give priority to wheelchairs. So we do need to.
Well, so there's a further appeal, isn't it? It's going to the Supreme
Yes,
Court.
yes, Supreme
But my point is, the reason those spaces are there in buses is for wheelchairs.
That was the original reason.
That was the reason for putting them there. So, I think we need to be clear that that's what they're for and make sure they're used for that purpose. And if it does require a change in the law arising from these appeals, then we'll have to make that. I think that we do need to look at what is happening at rail stations with staffing, and I think the way to do that is in the franchise negotiations and the contracts which are renewed from time to time. There should be much more emphasis on security and accessibility at the stations, and also at the availability of British Transport Police at stations as well. That's, I think, a rather neglected element of those franchise negotiations at the moment. And one of the 7 points in the Transport for All list was that people, wheelchair users, should not be charged extra for a wheelchair. Now, I would be appalled if anyone was charged extra. I wonder whether that's something that's maybe different outside London. But certainly, if there's anyone locally, if there was anyone locally who was having to pay extra for carrying a wheelchair in a taxi, then I'd very much like to know about that.
Yeah, but it's not a compulsory licence condition. That's the problem.
And I would also be delighted to take the trip with a disabled person.
Could I just also,
Me too.
you quoted the 100 million. If you look at the Department for Transport's press release on the 29th of April 2014, it was a further 100 million. So it wasn't actually a reduction.
Well, no, the amount per year is less. It was 43 million a year in the period that we're coming to the end of, and it's a smaller amount per year in the period up to 2019. So it's a cut.
No, we're sustaining the original one.
No.
Gentlemen, can we argue the semantics later, please?